Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who challenge us to think differently and lead better. What if the biggest myth in corporate learning isn't about what we teach, but how we think people learn? Every year, organizations pour millions into longer programs, fancier slides, polished facilitators, believing that better delivery equals better results. But the science tells us a very different story. Roughly half of learning outcomes have nothing to do with the trainer in the room. They depend on what people do in between the sessions, how they plan, monitor, and practice in short, focused bursts. Today, we're going straight to the source with two of the world's leading learning scientists. Dr. John Dunlosky, professor of psychology at Kent State University, is a co-author of many best-selling books, including the landmark review that redefined how we understand effective learning strategies. His research uncovers why techniques like spaced retrieval, interleaving, and successive relearning outperform the more traditional approaches. My other guest is Dr. Regan Gurung, professor of psychology at Oregon State University. He specializes in translating those insights into real practices that work in classrooms, companies, and leadership programs. Together, we're going to tackle the biggest misconceptions in learning and replace them with proven science-backed learning strategies for mastering anything faster. Because in the end, learning doesn't live in the classroom or in the training. It lives in the days after, when people practice, test, and refine what they know. So this is the science of learning how to learn, and it might just be the most important competitive advantage you can build. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Welcome to the program, John and Regan.
Thanks so much.
Good to be here.
I'd love to start each episode out with just our listeners learning more about each of you. I'll start with you, John. What got you interested in learning science and this work?
Originally, I was doing research on aging and memory and about how poor our memory gets as we get older and trying to discover techniques that help older adults learn better. So that was originally what I did 30 years ago. And slowly, I realized that older adults are doing quite well for themselves. Who really needs all of this effective study strategies are students. So about 20 years ago, when I moved to Kent State, I kind of reoriented my research program. Instead of focusing on the older adult side of the equation, which I'm still very interested in now that I'm myself an older adult, but also on how a variety of strategies apply to younger adults and improving their learning. So I've always been really interested in self-regulated learning and trying to discover techniques to help students learn better. But it's kind of shifted my focus from the age of those students, starting first in their 80s, now all the way to grade school. So I think all of it is relevant. And the good news is what holds for older adults holds for younger adults. Like we all learn the same, regardless of what age you are. So
I love that you brought up that distinction, John, because you're right. I hear that a lot, that what works in childhood learning works in adult learning for the most part as well.
Yeah. So, interestingly enough, something that you said in the introduction is something that caught my interest, which is there are presentations given all the time. Teachers give presentations, people give presentations. But why is it that so little of what's being presented is actually absorbed? What do you need to do? And 25 years ago, when I had a very high teaching load, I started thinking about what are those factors that influence or prevent students from getting what teachers are presenting. And I started looking at that. How can we tweak presentations? What's the best way to present? And not just what is it that teachers are doing to present information, but once information is presented, what do students have to do? And so my training is as a social personality psychologist. I like looking at the situation. I look at the personalities. And I thought this context, learning and listening, what are the personal factors? What are the social factors that help us predict what's going on? So that's how I started getting into it. And the bulk of my work was immediately in the classroom because I teach very large classes. I teach introductory psychology, sometimes to 400 people. And I'm always on the lookout for what can we find to make sure those students learn that material and then apply it to their lives for the rest of their lives. And I think that's those two parts right there, not just study something for a test, but especially something that's important in the business setting is apply it and use it for over the long term.
Thank you, Regan. The first question I really wanted to ask both of you is why is it important to teach adults how to learn instead of just giving them more content? Because that seems to be what a lot of professional training's about, what the university setting's about, just giving you more content. Hopefully something will stick. It'll assimilate somehow, some way, and you'll be able to know how to apply it.
Obviously, the content is critical, right? Because you have to be focusing on something. One reason why it's essential to train many people on how to learn better is because when we go about learning on our own, we receive a lot of input from the environment that gives us really incorrect signals about how well we're learning. So we might be reading something for the second time and we have this sense of familiarity, fluency with it. We think, wow, we really have this down now because it makes a lot of sense to me, right? In the moment, it's fluent, it's great. It turns out this sense of fluency is just one of many kind of misconceptions that we have that fluent learning means good learning that can lead to poor learning. And it turns out that adult learners, as well as children learners, have these trip ups in their learning processes that they feel like they're getting someone where they're not. What they need to do, unfortunately, is learn about more effective techniques that unfortunately might signal to the standard learner that I'm struggling. So now they're using something better, but they're struggling. They're telling themselves I'm struggling and I'm not learning when in fact they're learning effectively. So why we need to train individuals on a variety of effective study strategies is because these are ones that if you pick up without training, you'll begin to use it, you'll get the feeling that you aren't learning, and you'll give up. Whereas if you just stick with it, you'll finally get to a point where what you're learning will really stick with you. And that's the goal. So even though some of these strategies are pretty obvious, it's not something that people tend to pick up and use on their own. So I think some strategy training is critical.
Great answer. Thank you. Because you're right. Many of them are counterintuitive. There's those desirable difficulties. So you feel like you're not learning as well as if you're learning just with conventional means, such as highlighting or rereading the text, which is not effective at all. Regan, what do you think is the single biggest misconception that adults have about their learning?
Oh boy, I have so many to choose
Or
from, and I
maybe a
was
few. You don't have to single out just one.
right. I think the biggest one that comes to mind that I like leading with when I think about that kind of question is I think we have these misperceptions of what learning is, and when left to our own devices, we do things that we've heard about that we think should work but just don't. And I think the biggest misperception is that learning needs to be easy. And I always start there. So many times we hear this in school. I hear this when people are walking out of a seminar. Oh, that was hard. Well, yeah, learning is hard. And being prepared for that up front, I think, is really important because just like deep processing, and you talked about desirable difficulties. Why desirable difficulties? Because it's pushing for deeper processing. We spend more attention. And those are some of those hallmarks, foundational things. To learn, you pay attention, you put effort, you process deeper. And that's why I think we got to drop that, oh, learning's easy. And if it's hard, then it's not for me.
So many adults that I've noticed, and I'm a culprit as well, I have this overconfidence in what I think I know because I haven't really tested myself afterward. But it really inhibits the way you can learn moving forward because you think, oh, this is familiar. It's something that I understand. So I must be learning it effectively.
I think one major trip up, we could talk about both skill learning and kind of knowledge learning, but where you're going to trip up most with that particular misconception that, easy learning is good learning is probably when you're first learning a skill because you're in the process of learning it. You're doing it in real time. You're repeating it to try to get it down. And if at that point of developing this skill, you get the sense like, wow, you have this down. I really know it. That's often a misconception. I used to get this a lot while I was playing guitar. It's like, well, I have this lick down. Well, that's great. I have it down right now in the moment. But if I wait 2 days, play it in front of an audience, I'm going to trip up horribly and embarrass myself. So the key is for many of these difficulties we have when we're learning and we're getting kind of the sense of overconfidence and familiarity, the way to sidestep that issue, quite frankly, is to put everything down, wait a day or two, come back and evaluate whether it's still fluent. Now, if you come right back and you could do this skill, you have that knowledge right at the tip of your brain, and you're really facile with it, well, then you might be okay because now you've retained that skill, that knowledge for a couple days. The idea, though, is that you need to monitor your progress toward learning a new skill in context where you might find yourself failing. So it's really embracing the idea that you got to be open to failure, right? Learning is difficult. So if you can understand that I'm going to put myself in situations where I'm going to fail so I can learn what I'm struggling with so that I can focus on that. That's a good self-regulated learner. But you've got to be ready and open to failure. Because if it's worth learning, it's probably not something you're going to learn on a single trial.
There's something called the curse of knowledge, right? And I like sharing that because when we try to figure out whether we know something, it's one thing to wait one more day to see if we still know it. Absolutely. But even before you go that far, what I see happening so often is we ask ourselves, do I know this? And if we've got the what we want to know in front of us, and we ask ourselves, oh, do I know this while I'm looking at it? We get this inflated sense of confidence that is misleading. But that's one of the biggest things I think that people need to be aware of. And what a great example of something that cognitive science shows that is not common sense, is not something that I think most people are aware of. That's one of my favorite, the curse of knowledge. Watch for that. See if you know something when that something is not in front of you.
Great insight. And you're right, the curse of knowledge. And we see this a lot with educators, experts. I know Henry Roediger said this, that as you know more and more, you speak in a more abstract language, and you don't know what it was like not to know something. Whereas the beginner mind needs it in more concrete details. It needs more examples, varied examples, so they can have that far transfer, not just near transfer to the material. So be aware of that, that as you're trying to train and teach others, as your knowledge increases, you have to keep it grounded because it's really hard to do once you become the expert. And you mentioned, John, too, that Dunning-Kruger effect, where people that don't know a whole lot about a certain subject feel like they are very overconfident in what they know. As you become the expert in it, you realize your shortcomings and you have a better gauge, right, of what you know and don't know. But when you're first entering into any domain, that's the scary time where you probably overestimated your overconfidence, and you need to employ some of these proven learning strategies really to assess what you actually know and don't know.
Absolutely. In fact, this is where the trainer comes in play, and it's absolutely critical because for a novice learner, I mean, as someone who had plenty of grad students throughout his career, as the mentor, my goal was to monitor their knowledge because it's very difficult for a first year, second year, even. I mean, for me as a postdoc, I still needed help monitoring what I knew and didn't know, although I realized I always didn't know quant. That's one thing where Dunning-Kruger were wrong. I was unskilled at quant, and I was always aware that I was unskilled at quantitative, right? So at least there was some connection there. But otherwise, trainers are great for trying to identify where those blind spots are in their students or the people they're trying to train. In fact, I think that's one valuable skill that a trainer can bring, different techniques to evaluate how well the students are actually learning the content so they can kind of revise their teaching in the moment.
Well, Reagan, I know that you teach a lot right now, and I see this and hear this a lot with professional training as well. Why do I need to know it? I can just put it into Chat GPT. Why is having knowledge and memory still a competitive advantage these days?
Yeah, that's easy. I think for any of us who try to pop something into ChatGPT or whichever AI that you want, and there are a lot of good ones out there. If you don't have some basics of what's good and what's wrong, you cannot critically evaluate what you're getting. And it's not just, a couple of quick examples. Everybody picks on the hallucinations or the wrong stuff. Well, firstly, that's the lowest hanging fruit. If you don't have a sense of when a citation is wrong or how to chase it down or how to get it, you're going to take a hallucination and run with it, right? But that's easy. It's low hanging fruit. Don't do that. It's even things like grammar and writing, which, a lot of people use some AI for grammar and writing. And for us as psychologists for APA style. But if you don't know APA style or how to write, you're not going to know if AI has done it wrong. And I see this very, very frequently where folks will pop a reference into AI to get APA style, and they'll just give me what AI has given them. And sometimes that APA style is wrong, but they wouldn't know. You only know that if you actually know what the basics are. But even more than that, though, I think, especially in this context of learning, if you're thinking about lifelong learning, the reality is you may be able to use AI, but your own critical thinking capabilities, your skills are slowly going to dwindle. And there's already some research coming out that is showing this, that, the moment you use AI for a little bit, you're not attacking challenging problems in the same critical way. And the way I like to think about it is, sure, AI can write an email, but I can write it faster, and I'm spending less time revising what AI gave me. And I think that applies for paper writing, that applies for any of those main skills. And if you're in a company, if you're in a business, you want to develop those skills and get really strong at those skills, because at the end of the day, every week now, it seems like networks are going down. That's scary.
Don't outsource your thinking, leverage it. I've used all these proven learning strategies within the AI framework to reinforce and make the learning stronger, more effective. But there's that tendency, because we're all lazy and our brains are lazy, is just to outsource the thinking instead of using it for the right purposes. And in terms of self regulated or professional learning, it really boils down to two things. One is the retention part, and the other is the application part. The retention part, there's lots of great strategies. Both of you have covered in Study Like a Champ, great book, and you've covered, John, and another research. But the favorite one that I hear from a lot of learning scientists is a combination of two, and that's spaced recall. It's using spacing and it's using recall, because unlike in school, where cramming works great if you have the test the next day, that's not the case when you get outside of school. You want to be able to keep this information, this knowledge within you, and have it queued at the right time, at the right place to be able to utilize it. So, talk to me about your favorite strategy regarding the retention piece. If it's not space recall, then name the one that is both of your favorites, and give our listeners some insight into how to use those in a professional setting.
The retention part is critical. Note, you could still just keep looking up on Chat GPT. What are the definitions of all these components of the system I'm working with? Note that anything that's complicated, good luck if you have to look up the definitions of all the components of the system that you're using to then put them together in your head in order to apply that later on. What makes an expert is they can do all this in a very facile way because all the content is right there. It's retained and usable. So I think in many ways, using ChatGPT is going to fail miserably because you can get all the information, but you can't necessarily use it effectively. Now, to retain the content, I'm a big fan of successive relearning, but I'm also a big fan of first deciding what you really need to learn. And I want to stress this before we get into the strategies, because some of the techniques that we think are really effective, I wouldn't recommend people use them on everything because they do take time. Learning is difficult. It's hard. If you want to become an expert and really know things, you're going to have to work at it, plan, and goal set. The first thing I tell students, it's fine if you don't want to master everything. In fact, anymore, I'm just assuming that you don't want to master everything. But if you do find that one area that you really want to excel in, then is when you start using some of these a little bit more, say, costly in time strategies that can really get you to long-term benefits. Here's a silly one, flashcards. Yeah, I would use flashcards as a professional to the degree that you can make an appropriate test for any kind of skill. And note, these don't have to be real cards. They could be virtual. All it is a cue to cue you on what skill you want to practice that you need to know on your job, whether it's learning lots of people's names or a new technique. And then you just have to cycle back every so often to practice again using your set of cards or whatever they are. What I get asked often is, well, how do I know when to cycle back? And Bob Bjork would tell you, well, you want to cycle back right before you're about to forget what you want to learn. Well, the question then becomes, well, how am I supposed to know right before I'm about to forget? Well, you don't know that, right? We're horrible at that. So you need to set a schedule, right? Where you're going to cycle back to the most important stuff that you really need to learn in a fashion that allows you to excel in your job. So if you only need to use this knowledge every so often, then you don't cycle back as often to refresh yourself. If this is content you use a lot, note that in using it in the context of your job, you are functionally cycling it back. I mean, it took me years to learn cognitive psychology because I only cycled back to it once a year when I taught it. So it's all about coming back to what you need to learn to refresh yourself. and not just reading that content, but coming back to refresh in a way that allows you to simulate the context that you'll be using it. So I'm saying simulate like a test, but it could be anything depending on the skill you're trying to learn. So my favorite strategy is by far successive relearning, but maybe Regan has something to add to that.
Well, that is hands down the research-based favorite. Mine is even a little bit more simple than that. I like to think about it as a blank slate approach. And this is what I tell anybody I talk to who's trying to retain a lot of information for longer use, which is your best way to know it, and you'll notice the link here to the curse of knowledge in some ways, which is my favorite. But the blank slate approach is take a blank sheet of paper and write down everything you know about that topic with an application. And that I think that blank slate part is so important because so often people, even if they are not looking at the content, I'll see them do this. They'll look thoughtfully into the distance and try to recall in their heads. That's still not the same thing as writing everything down. But I do that so often with so many students, and I always start with a blank slate. So when I'm talking to somebody about something, I will just take my chalk pen and draw it on my desk, but starting with blank and then filling out all the details. And the process of doing that is automatically really solidifying it in my head. So that is my hands down favorite, which is, and it's a form of retrieval practice, of course, but it's a very specific, pragmatic way that ensures that you're not just lost in your thoughts and you're not being skewed by what you can see.
In the context of training too, just to have your students come back several days later and have them train what they just were trained. It's basically a form of teaching someone else, which is very effective. But what you'll find is if you actually try this out on your own, that before you have them train the other individuals several days later, just ask them, well, how well do you know this? And almost all of them say, yeah, I got it. Then they'll try to walk through it and train someone else and they'll realize, I kind of have a familiarity with it. But that's different than having knowledge of it and being able to use it. But when you train someone else, you'll basically learn what you know and what you don't know, which I think is kind of a blank slate-ish approach, but not writing it down. Now you're just speaking it out to somebody else.
And I think there's something to that writing it down that becomes so important. And I have an anecdote from just Friday where in a lab meeting, I had some students say, all right, go up to the blackboard and draw out your design and explain your study. And there was a student who's extremely confident, extremely smart. They went up there and they drew it wrong. And both they and I realized that, wait a minute, they thought they knew it, but they didn't know it. And that wouldn't have happened if they didn't go up there and actually try to map it out. So I love that training others kind of concept, but that's exactly it. It's okay, show me, illustrate it. And that's when it really highlights some shortcomings in how we do things.
I've taught at the college level as well for many years, and I get that a lot from students that come up and say, well, I knew it. Okay, well, explain it to me. You knew it on a familiar basis. You couldn't recollect it. It wasn't deeply embedded for that recollection to happen on the time of the test. And I love successive relearning. I hear students a lot that state, well, doesn't that make it longer? Because now I'm having to go back and relearn the old material as well as the new material. So, John, perhaps just unpack that strategy and give me an example for our listeners. If they were to use it, how would they go about doing that?
Successive relearning is pretty straightforward. So you'd sit down with some content that you want to learn. It could be pretty simple stuff. And you practice it until you can, in many contexts, retrieve what you're trying to learn or produce that skill or write everything down from memory. That's the learning part. The relearning is that you come back on a different session and you test yourself on that same content. Probably will fail to begin with. And then you have to relearn it. That is, you study it again and test yourself, study and test until you get it right, until you can perform that skill. Then you come back again at several days later, do the same thing, rinse and repeat, basically. What you'll find is that when you come back multiple times, what you thought was nearly impossible to learn the first time, or at least the second time when you came back and failed, after 3 or 4 sessions, now this content is learned so well that you immediately draw it right from memory. So I think it's extremely successful in that. And the thing is, students will say, well, that's a lot of work because they're used to cramming. I can tell you that when you ask people, whether it's students or anyone you're training, whether they've learned something well in their life. Most people have. Ask them how they learned it. And what they're going to describe to you is successive relearning. So a 15-year-old who's really good at Celtic dancing, they're horrible at school and they just say, I'm not a good learner and I'm terrible, but yet they can really incredible dancer. And you ask them, well, how'd you get so good at dancing? And they'll describe successive relearning. That is, they tried a particular dance out, they didn't get it, they tried again until they got it. Guess what? The next day, they're excited, right? They want to learn this, so they come back and do it again until you get it right. That's successive relearning. So most people are very familiar with it. They just don't apply it to learning content and knowledge. They only think about it in context of learning skills and so forth. So I think it's very valuable. Everyone uses it. All of our students are really good at first action shooter games. They're good at it because they use successive relearning getting there. It just didn't seem like work, where, at least for me, learning chemistry seems like work. But you use the same kinds of strategies to get good at that as you would at a game.
Retrieval practice, close the book and try to retrieve the information from memory instead of looking at anything. Spacing is space it out over time instead of one mass study session, because you arrest the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, and forgetting is a very active process. And that's the number one question that I think every leading cognitive scientist gets asked is, how often should I recollect it? Well, like Robert York said, not so long that you forget everything, but long enough to where you forget some things. So it's unique to that situation, and it's a trial and error process, but retrieval practice, spaced practice, so much more effective for adult learners that really want this information to be remembered and used. Let's talk about the application, Regan, and that transfer issue. Because when I talked to Daniel Willingham out of the University of Virginia, he had stated that when you learn something new, you always learn it shallow. Well, it's always the surface structures only. And I think with corporate training, we set everyone up for failure to think, okay, I'm going to teach this to you, and you're going to be able to use this in a myriad of circumstances and transfer it far and wide. And that hasn't been the case. And I don't think that's really what learning science supports is when you first acquire the knowledge, it's going to be shallow regardless, correct?
Yes, the direct answer to your question is unless you are putting in effort and paying attention and then further processing it, it's going to be shallow. You got to do some work with it. But I think something else that's really important for us to think about here too, and that we often forget, whether it's in the classroom or in a corporate presentation, is that there are some individual differences. And it gets into the fact that even if it's something as simple as how long does it take you to process something I am saying? There are some listeners who will have to listen to what we are saying right now and give it 5 more seconds than other listeners. But that those individual differences can make a difference in how people apply it and how they transfer to other situations. So I think a savvy presenter tries to make sure that they are taking into account some of the individual differences there, and then really doubling down on those strategies that'll apply across the board. I'm going to give one big example that I often remind myself of, other teachers that I spoke to of, and anybody presenting to a crowd is you may be the most energetic, engaging speaker, but if you are not giving your audience time to absorb and process what you are saying, it's going to be shallow. It's going to go out because people need time to process, rehearse, to make that move from even short-term memory to working memory to long-term memory, to make that, right? And that's to circle back to your question. For that transfer to happen, we've got to be putting things into long-term memory and putting them into long-term memory in such a way that we can retrieve it when it's important. And I think that's why all these strategies that I've been talking about become so important, because that's the goal. That's the prize that our eye is on, is to transfer it into long-term memory so we can then get it back out well.
And you're right, that cognitive overload sets in so quickly. And working memory capacity, part of it is able to be improved, other part is pretty fixed. So you really have to identify what you can do with your working memory to really process this information. If you're an expert, you can chunk the information, and that helps you to absorb more of it in a faster manner. And if you don't have the expertise, if you have a shorter working memory capacity, then those are some definite pitfalls and some limitations in that transfer. Are there any strategies that that self-regulated learners can use to improve the transfer, or that instructors can use to really make sure that they maximize the amount of transfer that can happen, regardless of the learner they have in front of them?
There are a variety of reasons why you may fail to transfer knowledge, some of which are pretty benign, actually. And some of the earliest research I did with older adults, we train them with a strategy, obvious one, very simple, like practice retrieving. Then we give them a new thing to do, which obviously afforded that new strategy that we just trained them. And most older adults wouldn't use that new strategy in this context. Okay, so this is just an obvious lack of transfer. Well, like many other cognitive scientists, transfer is like a game for us. I train you something in a vacuum, and the magic is, will you suddenly miraculously use this outside of the vacuum? Okay, that's the standard transfer-oriented nonsense that I really dislike outside of education. Education should be about learner-oriented transfer. There's no magic, there's no games. When you train something that you want them to use in other contexts, tell them, I'm training you X. I want you to use X. This is going to be important for you to use in all these contexts. So at least there's a chance that's a benign kind of transfer. You just gave me this tool. I guess I should use it in these new places. That's a trainer thing. Another trainer thing that's less benign is, well, I have the shallow knowledge, but I don't have the deeper knowledge where I can actually transfer and use that in other contexts. So even if I'm told, look, I just trained you on this really important technique that you need to use in your job, and I want you to use it in these other contexts. If you can't use it there, it's because you don't understand it well enough. That's where a trainer comes in, because now the trainer has to identify, geez, how I just trained them to use this, they can't transfer it. They don't understand the links. It's often the problem was with analogy. I don't see how the training context is analogous to the one you want me to use it. That's where the trainer needs to actually give them practice. I'm going to train you something valuable. You need to understand it to solve these kinds of problems and to give them different kinds of problems to see if they can do it. I mean, really, as a training focus, this all has to do with having the trainer monitor outcomes and student learning. And admittedly, it's something that has been undervalued in education, even at our level in college, where we don't spend enough time with low-level assessments that are feedback for the teacher to help the students develop things like transfer. And part of the issue, it's not our fault, is that we're trying to teach students way too much. So again, trainers, think about what you really want your students to take away, get rid of all the rest of the stuff, and focus on learning just that content. Don't get me wrong, inside education, sometimes you just have to let students experience lots of content, but then let's not worry about if they learned it. Let's just have them experience it. Anyway, so training, transfer, I say train for transfer. Just don't hope that it magically happens.
And John, I need to push that even further, right? When you say training, I think so often we make these assumptions that people will then do it. Oh, you're an adult, you can go do it. I'm going to push it further by saying when a company is doing a training session or a workshop, especially if it's a longer one, I advocate for building in explicit times for transfer. I'm doing a day-long workshop coming up this week. On the workshop agenda are 10-minute slots after I do a session, time for people to process what we just talked about in the hour before, time without checking email, time without going in and doing something else, time exclusively to spend on what just transpired. We human beings are so caught up, and I'm not going onto the phone social media rant. For many adults, self-regulation is hard. And the more we can do as trainers, whether it's a school setting, but even in corporate settings, the more we can do in these professional settings to help people self-regulate, the better.
Excellent points both of you made regarding this, because you're right. Design for transfer, it's not going to happen by accident. I know we live in a cult of content where it's just more and more content, and it needs to be dialed back. Time for reflection, time for transfer, the practical applications that we just don't see enough of. And John, you mentioned something important with this transfer effect is they need to be able to make analogies to say, this is like this. And that comes with practice, and that comes with seeing a variety of different problems so they can make those analogies. And then the other critical piece is being able to map this problem to that problem correctly. Because even if they see the analogy, they may not be able to map the parts correctly to really make that the solution. So critical with the transfer piece. And we've been talking it from a standpoint of the trainer perspective, but this can be equally effective and the same for individuals. They need to spend time reflecting with identifying and be more deliberate. How am I going to use this moving forward? And another great strategy that we haven't touched upon, but I'd like to do now is interleaving. And that's really mixing up the different types of problems. And in a professional space, it could be where you practice feedback across different scenarios, maybe some praise, maybe some correction scenarios, some coaching, some performance review. So you're engaging in not just repeating one script, you're being able to discriminate between context cues and choose the right tone, timing, and approach for each one. And math is the most common example. Let's work 20 problems of this type until we get it. And then let's work 20 problems of that type. But on the test, we don't see it that way. They're all mixed up.
Exactly. Yeah, interleaving is a good one. And in fact, I think at least it's named appropriately. I think retrieval practice is good too, right? So you're just interleaving different problems. Lots of researchers have been exploring interleaving for the last 15 years. And I think there's a lot of promise in interleaving your practice of different activities for a variety of reasons. I think the question is, why does it work? And in some context, it may work because you need to contrast different kinds of problem sets to see that there's a difference so you know which direction you're going. That said, at least some of the research I conducted about 10 years ago, and a variety of other people as well, suggests that one of the major benefits of interleaving is that it forces you to space your practice. So that by interleaving different problem sets, you're not just practicing the same one over and over again. So you get this natural spacing in the context of interleaving. So I kind of see the benefit of interleaving maybe as twofold. You get the space practice, and then you're really forced to discriminate, make it a little bit more difficult between the kinds of problem. Absolutely essential for learning math, because I would assume engineers just aren't given a certain type of problem and they just know what the problem is. They have to go out and probably develop the problem and the solutions. By the way, I'm not an engineer. Okay. But that's where interleaving could be really effective. So if you're going to go and pick up your favorite learning app, make sure it does interleaving for you in a way that can help you out. Otherwise, space practice, I would say, is definitely the way to go.
How does priming work? Because there's more research about this, where before you learn something, you're priming your brain to recall as much as you know about it, which then when they take a post test on that material, they do better as a result. Even if you haven't been trained on it, you don't know much about it. Talk to me more about that process and how professionals can use it to amplify their learning.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things to tell people is that take a test on something before you've even studied it, because it's going to get your brain ready to take the stuff in that you're going to study. And that's a form of what you're talking about here. There's a lot of work being done on practice questions or pre-questions where you answer some questions before a lecture, then take the lecture, and then automatically your brain is consciously, non-consciously paying more attention to those questions that you studied before the lecture. And that's kind of, it's priming you for, or getting you ready for what information is coming. Now, often, of course, when we talk about priming, it's, we talk about it in the context of schema activation, right? I mean, if you're struggling to remember something, if you can remember one part of it, it activates those schemas, and then you can remember the rest. And that's one of the things that I think happens with interleaving, even beyond the math, is that when you're putting different content side by side, or students are studying, or a person is studying disparate content. The math example is word problems versus numerical problems. But you can take it to, a content area where I'm studying a chapter on biological psychology versus a chapter on cognitive psychology. By virtue of intermixing the biology and the cognition, you're forcing the brain to draw the boundaries between those and make them sharper, so that it's not the same thing. It's not just mix it up for novelty, or it's not just mix it up for dishabituation. It's actually mix it up so that it forces you to categorize those topics better. And that's, I think, something we don't talk about enough when we talk about interleaving and how things can be.
I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.